The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez walked through the main gate, her worn duffel bag slung over her shoulder. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of facing impossible odds. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were ordinary civilian wear, nothing that would draw attention to her remarkable past. The security guard at the checkpoint barely glanced at her identification before waving her through. Sarah had grown accustomed to this reaction. People saw what they expected to see: a young woman, perhaps a military spouse or civilian contractor. They never imagined that beneath her unassuming exterior lay the heart of someone who had served in the most elite units of the United States military. Sarah was here for a reunion of sorts, though she dreaded it more than anticipated it. The annual gathering brought together veterans from various special operations units, a chance for old comrades to reconnect and share stories that the outside world would never fully understand. For most attendees, it was a celebration of brotherhood and shared sacrifice. For Sarah, it was a minefield of skepticism and barely concealed hostility. She made her way toward the main hall where registration was taking place. The building buzzed with the energy of reunion, filled with men who had served in the Army Rangers, Green Berets, and Delta Force. Their voices carried the easy camaraderie of those who had faced danger together and lived to tell about it. Sarah knew that her presence would disrupt that comfortable atmosphere. As she approached the registration table, conversations began to quiet around her. She felt the weight of curious stares and heard the whispered conversations that always seemed to follow her at these events. The woman behind the registration table, a volunteer spouse, looked up with a polite smile that faltered slightly when Sarah stated her name and unit affiliation. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" the volunteer asked, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "Sarah Martinez, SEAL Team 6, Sarah replied calmly, though she could feel her jaw tighten slightly. She had been through this routine countless times before. The woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Behind Sarah, she could hear someone snort with barely suppressed laughter. Another voice muttered something about stolen valor, just loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah handed over her paperwork, the same documents she had presented at dozens of similar events. Her service record was impeccable, her credentials authentic. Yet she knew that the real challenge lay not in the paperwork, but in the court of public opinion that surrounded her wherever she went. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion," the volunteer said gently, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "The Navy SEALs don't accept women. Perhaps you meant to register with a different unit." The buzz of conversation around them had died completely now. Sarah was acutely aware that she had become the center of attention, and not in a positive way. She could feel dozens of eyes boring into her back, could sense the mixture of amusement and irritation radiating from the gathered veterans. "There's no confusion," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the familiar frustration building in her chest. "I served with SEAL Team 6 for 4 years. My paperwork is in order." A tall man with graying hair and the bearing of a career military officer stepped forward from the crowd. His name tag identified him as Colonel Richards, and his expression was a mixture of skepticism and barely restrained anger. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but stolen valor is a federal crime. The SEALs have never admitted women, period. Whatever fantasy you're living in needs to end right now." Sarah felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had faced this accusation more times than she could count, and losing her temper had never helped her cause. Instead, she reached into her bag and withdrew a folder containing her service documentation. "I'm not playing any games, sir," she replied. "My service record speaks for itself." Colonel Richards barely glanced at the papers she offered. "Anyone can fake documents these days," he said dismissively. "The fact remains that no woman has ever served as a Navy SEAL. You're either delusional or you're running some kind of con, and either way you don't belong here." The crowd around them had grown larger, and Sarah could see phones being pulled out as people began recording what they clearly expected to be her public humiliation. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same mixture of outrage and anticipation she had encountered at military forums, veteran gatherings, and online communities where her story had become a lightning rod for controversy. "I understand your skepticism," Sarah said. raising her voice slightly so that everyone in the vicinity could hear her. The military has traditionally been a male-dominated institution, and change doesn't come easily. But the fact that something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it's impossible. It's not about tradition, Colonel Richards shot back. It's about capability. The SEALs maintain standards that are physically and mentally beyond what any woman can achieve. Pretending otherwise does a disservice to every man who has earned that trident. Sarah felt something inside her snap. For years she had endured these accusations with patience and dignity, hoping that eventually the truth would speak for itself. But standing here, surrounded by men who refused to even consider the possibility that she might be telling the truth, she realized that patience alone would never be enough. "You want to talk about standards?" she asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Let's talk about the night in Afghanistan when my team extracted a downed pilot from behind enemy lines. Let's discuss the classified operation in Syria, where we neutralized a high-value target that had been eluding conventional forces for months. Or maybe we should talk about the Bronze Star I earned when I carried a wounded teammate 3 miles through hostile territory." Colonel Richards' face had grown red with anger. "Enough," he barked. "I've heard enough of your fabricated war stories. Security needs to escort this woman off the premises before she causes any more disruption." As if summoned by his words, 2 military police officers appeared at Sarah's sides. They looked uncomfortable with the situation, but clearly felt obligated to respond to the colonel's demand. One of them, a young sergeant with kind eyes, spoke to her in a respectful tone. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," he said apologetically. "We can sort this out at the security office." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing a mixture of hostility, amusement, and in a few cases, what might have been sympathy. She had known this day would come eventually, had always understood that her claims would eventually push someone too far. As she was led away, she could hear the excited chatter erupting behind her, could imagine how this story would spread through military communities like wildfire. But as they walked toward the security building, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Because she knew something that Colonel Richards and his supporters didn't know. She knew that in exactly 3 hours their comfortable assumptions about what was possible were about to be shattered forever. The security office was a sterile, windowless room with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh shadows. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable metal chair across from Sergeant Williams, the military police officer who had escorted her from the reunion. Unlike the hostile crowd she had just left, Williams seemed genuinely interested in hearing her side of the story. "Look, ma'am," he began, consulting the paperwork spread across his desk. "I've seen a lot of stolen valor cases come through here, and most of them fall apart pretty quickly. But your documentation is, well, it's either incredibly sophisticated forgery or it's the real thing." Sarah appreciated his measured approach, though she could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. "It's real, Sergeant. Every page of it." Williams picked up one of the documents, studying it carefully. "The problem is, everything I know about military history tells me that women have never served in the SEALs. It's not that I don't believe women are capable of extraordinary things, but the Navy has been pretty clear about their position on this." "The Navy's public position," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference between what the military tells the public and what actually happens in classified operations." The sergeant leaned back in his chair, clearly wrestling with the implications of her statement. "Are you telling me there's some kind of secret program? That the military has been lying to Congress and the American people about women in combat roles?" Sarah chose her words carefully. Even now, even facing potential criminal charges, she was bound by oaths and classifications that ran deeper than her personal vindication. "I'm telling you that the needs of national security sometimes require flexibility that the public isn't ready to understand." Before Williams could respond, the office door opened and Colonel Richards entered, followed by 2 other senior officers Sarah didn't recognize. The colonel's face was still flushed with anger, and his eyes held the gleam of someone who believed he was about to witness justice being served. "Sergeant, I trust you've had enough time to verify that this woman's claims are fraudulent," Richards said without preamble. "I want her charged with stolen valor immediately." Williams looked uncomfortable with the direct pressure from his superior officers. "Sir, I have to admit that her documentation is quite convincing. I've called the Navy Personnel Command to verify her service record, but they're telling me that the information is classified above my clearance level." Of course it is, Richards scoffed. That's exactly what she's counting on. These stolen valor cases always involve claims that conveniently can't be verified through normal channels. It's textbook deception. One of the other officers, a Navy commander with sharp features and calculating eyes, stepped forward. The fact remains that the SEALs have never admitted women. This is established policy, not some state secret. The woman is clearly delusional or fraudulent, and either way she needs to face consequences. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She had always known that this moment might come, had always understood that her service record would eventually be challenged by someone with enough influence to make serious trouble for her. But sitting in this sterile room, facing men who had already made up their minds about her guilt, she realized that the truth alone might not be enough to save her. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I understand your skepticism. I know that my claims challenge everything you've been told about military policy. But before you destroy my reputation and potentially send me to prison, I'd like to make one phone call." Colonel Richards laughed harshly. "This isn't a movie, young lady. You don't get to call some mysterious contact who will magically validate your fantasy. This ends now." But Sergeant Williams held up a hand. Despite the pressure from his superiors, something in Sarah's demeanor had convinced him to give her the benefit of the doubt. "Actually, sir, she does have the right to make a phone call. And given the seriousness of the charges being discussed, I think we should allow it." The commander looked irritated by Williams's intervention. "Sergeant, you're allowing yourself to be manipulated by a skilled con artist. Every minute we waste on this charade is another minute she has to construct more lies." "Nevertheless," Williams replied firmly, "she gets her phone call." Sarah nodded gratefully to the sergeant, then pulled out her cell phone. The number she dialed was one she had memorized years ago but had hoped never to use. It rang twice before being answered by a voice she recognized immediately. "General Morrison's office," came the crisp response of his aide-de-camp. "This is Sarah Martinez," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I need to speak with the general immediately. Tell him it's about Project Nightingale." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Please hold," the aide said, and Sarah found herself listening to silence. Colonel Richards was growing more agitated by the second. "This is ridiculous. She's probably calling her boyfriend or some accomplice who's going to pretend to be a general. Are we really going to stand here and watch this performance?" But Sarah noticed that the Navy commander had gone very still, his sharp eyes fixed on her with sudden intensity. Something about the name she had mentioned had clearly gotten his attention. "Who did you say you were calling?" the commander asked quietly. "General Morrison," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off her phone. "I believe you might know him." The commander's face had gone pale. General Morrison was not just any general. He was one of the most senior officers in the Joint Special Operations Command, a man whose influence extended into the deepest levels of military planning and policy. If Sarah actually had access to him, it changed everything. "Ma'am," the aide's voice crackled through the phone. "The general will speak with you now." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she heard the familiar, gravelly voice that had once briefed her on some of the most dangerous missions of her career. "Sarah," General Morrison said, and she could hear both concern and anger in his tone. "What's your situation?" "Sir, I'm being held on suspicion of stolen valor at Fort Campbell. There are officers here who refuse to believe that I served with SEAL Team 6. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for nearly 30 seconds. When the general spoke again, his voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Put whoever's in charge on the phone," he said. "Now." Sarah looked at the three officers standing around her, noting how their expressions had changed from smug certainty to growing unease. Colonel Richards seemed to sense that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically, though he wasn't yet ready to abandon his position. "The general would like to speak with you," Sarah said, holding out her phone. Richards hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between his conviction that Sarah was a fraud and his growing suspicion that he might be making a terrible mistake. Finally, he took the phone. "This is Colonel Richards," he said, his voice slightly less confident than it had been moments before. Sarah couldn't hear the general's side of the conversation, but she could see the effect it was having on the colonel. His face went from red to white to gray as he listened, occasionally attempting to interject with "Yes, sir," or "I understand." "Sir?" The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but by the time it ended, Colonel Richards looked like a man who had just witnessed his own career ending. His hand trembled slightly as he handed the phone back to Sarah. "The general would like to speak with you again," he said quietly. Sarah took back the phone, noting how the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. "Yes, sir?" "Sarah, I'm going to send someone to collect you. In the meantime, I want you to show them your shoulder. They'll understand what that means." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone while three very worried-looking officers stared at her. She realized that the moment she had been dreading for years had finally arrived. There would be no more hiding, no more enduring the whispered accusations and skeptical looks. The truth was about to come out, whether she was ready for it or not. The silence in the security office stretched on for what felt like an eternity after Sarah ended her call with General Morrison. Colonel Richards stood frozen beside the desk, his face cycling through various shades of pale as the implications of the conversation began to sink in. The Navy commander had backed away slightly, as if putting physical distance between himself and what was clearly becoming a career-threatening situation. Sergeant Williams was the first to break the uncomfortable quiet. "Ma'am, the general mentioned something about your shoulder. What did he mean by that?" Sarah looked around at the three men, weighing her options. For years she had kept the mark hidden, understanding that revealing it would change everything about how she moved through the world. It was both proof of her service and a target that painted on her back, marking her as someone who possessed knowledge that certain people would kill to protect or expose. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels," she said slowly. "Once you see it, you become part of something that goes beyond stolen valor accusations or military policy debates. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Colonel Richards seemed to have found his voice again, though it lacked its earlier conviction. "Young lady, I don't know what kind of psychological game you're playing, but—" "Sir," Sergeant Williams interrupted, showing more backbone than Sarah had expected from someone so junior. "I think we need to listen to her. That phone call changed something, and we all know it." The commander, who had been silent since learning about General Morrison's involvement, finally spoke. "Show us," he said simply. Sarah nodded and began unbuttoning her shirt. The men looked away instinctively, but she stopped when the fabric was pulled aside enough to reveal her left shoulder. There, etched into her skin in precise black lines, was a tattoo unlike anything any of them had ever seen. It wasn't the typical military tattoo that adorned so many service members' bodies. This was something else entirely. A trident intertwined with wings, surrounded by symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light hit them. But it was the number beneath the design that made the commander's breath catch in his throat. "My God," he whispered. "That's a nightingale marking." Sergeant Williams looked confused, but Colonel Richards had gone completely white. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. Project Nightingale was terminated years ago. It was deemed too dangerous, too politically sensitive. Sarah smiled grimly as she rebuttoned her shirt. "Terminated is a relative term when it comes to black operations, Colonel. The project evolved, went deeper underground. Some of us continued serving long after the official records were sealed." "What is Project Nightingale?" Williams asked, looking between his superiors for answers that none of them seemed willing to provide. The commander found his voice first. "It was a classified program designed to test whether women could be successfully integrated into the most elite special operations units. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was one of the most successful military experiments in modern history. And one of the most controversial," Colonel Richards added, slumping into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The political implications were staggering. If word had gotten out that women were already serving in units like the SEALs, it would have fundamentally changed the entire debate about women in combat. Sarah nodded. "So it was buried. The participants were sworn to secrecy, our records were classified, and we were told to blend back into conventional society. Most of us have been living with the knowledge that our service would never be recognized, never be acknowledged." "But you kept showing up at veteran events," Williams observed. "You kept trying to tell your story. Why risk exposure?" "Because," Sarah said, her voice carrying years of accumulated frustration and pain, "I watched other veterans get the recognition and respect they deserved while I had to pretend that the most important years of my life never happened. I watched the military debate whether women could handle combat, while I knew for a fact that we had already proven ourselves beyond any doubt." The office door opened suddenly, and everyone turned to see a figure that made Colonel Richards stand up so quickly, he nearly knocked over his chair. The man entering was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform bore the stars of a brigadier general, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had spent years operating in the shadows of military intelligence. "Gentlemen," the general said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "I'm General Morrison. I believe we need to have a conversation." He looked around the room, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. When his gaze fell on Sarah, his expression softened slightly. "Sarah, are you all right?" "Yes, sir. Though I suspect my quiet retirement just came to an abrupt end." General Morrison nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. When I received your call, I knew that the time for secrecy had passed. The men in this room now know too much to maintain plausible deniability, which means we have some very serious decisions to make." Colonel Richards cleared his throat nervously. "General, I want to apologize for my earlier statements. I had no idea about the classified nature of Miss Martinez's service." "If I had known, you would have done exactly what you did," Morrison interrupted. "Your skepticism was not only natural but expected. The whole point of Project Nightingale was to operate so far below the radar that even senior military officers would have no knowledge of it." "Sir," the commander interjected, "what are the implications of this revelation? How do we proceed from here?" General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that went far beyond the confines of the small security office. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decisions that would affect not just the people in the room, but potentially the entire military establishment. "That depends," he said finally, "on what Sarah wants to do next." All eyes turned to her, and Sarah realized that she stood at a crossroads that would define not just her own future, but potentially the future of women in the military. For years she had dreamed of this moment, when her service would finally be acknowledged and validated. But now that it had arrived, she understood that recognition would come with a price that extended far beyond her personal situation. "General," she said slowly, "what happens if the truth comes out? What happens to the other Nightingales who are still living in the shadows?" Morrison's expression grew grave. "That's the question, isn't it? We have 12 women scattered across the country who participated in operations that officially never happened. Their safety, their privacy, their futures all hang in the balance." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The decision she made in the next few minutes would affect not just her own life, but the lives of women who had trusted her to keep their secrets. As she looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, she realized that some choices couldn't be undone once made. But she also realized that some truths were too important to remain buried forever. General Morrison closed the security office door behind him and activated a small electronic device that would prevent any surveillance equipment from recording their conversation. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from accusatory to conspiratorial, with everyone present understanding that they were now part of something much larger than a stolen valor investigation. "Before we go any further," Morrison began, "I need everyone in this room to understand the gravity of what we're discussing. Project Nightingale wasn't just an experiment in gender integration. It was a response to a very real operational need that arose during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts." He began pacing the small room, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that Sarah remembered from countless mission briefings years earlier. "We found ourselves facing enemies who used women and children as human shields, who operated in environments where male soldiers couldn't effectively gather intelligence or execute certain types of operations. We needed operators who could blend into populations, who could access areas that were off limits to men, who could earn the trust of women and children in ways that traditional forces couldn't." Sergeant Williams listened intently, beginning to understand the operational logic that had driven such a controversial program. "So you recruited women into the SEALs not for political correctness, but because the mission required it." "Exactly," Morrison confirmed. But the political implications were staggering. Congress was already debating women in combat roles, and the military leadership wasn't ready to reveal that we had already crossed that line. So Nightingale operated in complete secrecy, with participants recruited from various branches and backgrounds. Colonel Richards, who had been silent since his earlier humiliation, finally spoke up. "How were they selected? What made someone like Ms. Martinez suitable for such a program? Sarah answered before Morrison could respond. I was a Marine Corps intelligence specialist with a background in languages and cultural anthropology. I had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan working with female engagement teams, but I wanted to do more. When I was approached about Nightingale, they told me I could make a real difference in ways that traditional forces couldn't. The selection process was even more rigorous than standard SEAL training, Morrison added. We couldn't afford to have anyone fail once they were integrated into operational teams. Sarah was one of only 12 women who made it through the entire program. The Navy commander, who had been studying Sarah with new interest, asked, "What kinds of operations did you actually participate in?" Sarah looked to Morrison, who nodded his permission to speak. My first deployment was to a refugee camp in Syria, where we suspected human traffickers were operating. Male soldiers couldn't get close enough to gather the intelligence we needed, but I could pose as an aid worker and gain access to the women and children who were the primary victims. She paused, remembering the weight of that mission and the lives that had depended on her success. Over the course of 6 weeks, I identified the trafficking network, documented their operations, and provided the intelligence that allowed us to rescue over 40 victims and arrest the perpetrators. But that wasn't a SEAL operation, Richards observed. Not officially, Morrison interjected, but Sarah was working with a joint task force that included SEAL operators. Her integration with the team was so successful that she was formally transferred to SEAL Team 6 for her subsequent deployments. Williams looked fascinated by the implications. So she actually went through BUDS training? A modified version of it, Sarah replied. We couldn't train with the regular classes because of operational security, but we went through every element of the program. Water survival, weapons training, demolitions, close quarters combat, psychological conditioning. The standards weren't lowered. They were adapted to maintain secrecy. Morrison pulled out a folder that Sarah hadn't seen him carrying when he entered. Sarah's service record includes operations in 7 different countries over 4 years. She participated in hostage rescues, high-value target elimination, intelligence gathering, and training foreign military units. Her performance evaluations consistently ranked her in the top tier of all operators. Then why keep it secret? Williams asked. If the program was so successful, why not use it to demonstrate that women could serve in these roles? The question hung in the air for a moment before Morrison answered with the weariness of someone who had fought this battle at the highest levels of government. Politics. The military leadership was concerned that revealing Nightingale would create a firestorm that could undermine support for the broader war effort. There were members of Congress who had publicly stated that women had no place in direct combat roles, and admitting that we had already integrated them into the most elite units would have been seen as a betrayal of trust. So you sacrificed the recognition these women deserved for political expediency, Richards said, and Sarah was surprised to hear genuine anger in his voice. We made the decision that we believed best served national security interests, Morrison replied firmly, but that doesn't mean it was the right decision, and it doesn't mean the costs weren't significant. Sarah felt old wounds reopening as she listened to the conversation. Do you know what it's like to watch congressional hearings about whether women can handle combat, while knowing that you've already proven it beyond any doubt? Do you understand what it feels like to sit quietly while people debate your capabilities, as if you're not even in the room? Her voice carried years of accumulated frustration and pain. I've watched male veterans get jobs, get respect, get recognition for service that was often less dangerous and less demanding than what I did. Meanwhile, I've had to pretend that the most important and meaningful years of my life never happened. Morrison nodded sympathetically, which is why we find ourselves at this crossroads. Sarah's exposure today means that we can no longer maintain the fiction that Nightingale never existed. The question now is how we move forward. The commander leaned forward in his chair. What are the options? Option 1, Morrison began. We classify everything that happened here today at the highest levels, swear everyone to secrecy, and hope that word doesn't leak. Sarah returns to her civilian life and we continue pretending that women have never served in these roles. And option 2? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Option 2 is that we finally tell the truth. We acknowledge that Project Nightingale existed, that it was successful, and that women like Sarah have been serving with distinction in special operations roles for years. We deal with the political fallout and use this revelation to accelerate the integration of women into all military occupational specialties. Williams whistled softly. That would be huge. It would change everything about how the military approaches gender integration. It would also destroy the careers of everyone who participated in the cover-up, Richards observed quietly. Including yours, General, Morrison smiled grimly. Colonel, my career has been dedicated to serving this country in whatever way was needed, regardless of personal cost. If acknowledging the truth about these remarkable women means the end of my military service, then so be it. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that Morrison was willing to sacrifice everything to finally give her and the other Nightingales the recognition they deserved. But she also understood that the decision couldn't be made based on her needs alone. General, she said slowly, what about the other 11 women? Shouldn't they have a say in this decision? Morrison nodded. They should, and they will. But Sarah, you're the one who forced this moment by refusing to stay silent. The others have been content to live in the shadows, but you've been pushing for recognition for years. The question is, are you prepared to accept the consequences of finally getting what you've been asking for? Sarah looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, understanding that her answer would set in motion events that could not be undone. She thought about her fellow Nightingales, scattered across the country, living ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary secrets. She thought about the future women who might benefit from the truth being told, and she thought about the price that would be paid by everyone in the room if she chose to step into the light. But most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to herself years earlier, that someday somehow the truth would be told. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as she stood in the small security office, surrounded by men whose careers and futures now hung in the balance along with her own. General Morrison's electronic device continued to emit its subtle hum, ensuring that their conversation remained private. But Sarah knew that privacy was a luxury that wouldn't last much longer regardless of what she decided. I need to make some calls, she said finally. If we're going to do this, the other Nightingales deserve to know what's coming. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's the right approach. But Sarah, you should know that once those calls are made, there's no going back. The secret will be out and we'll have to deal with whatever comes next. I understand, Sarah replied, pulling out her phone again. But these women trusted me once to keep their secrets. Now I need to trust them to help me decide whether it's time to reveal them. The first number she dialed belonged to Maria Gonzalez, a former Army Ranger, who had participated in 3 Nightingale operations before transitioning to civilian life as a federal law enforcement officer. The conversation was brief but intense, with Sarah explaining the situation and asking for Maria's input on how to proceed. You know what my answer is, Maria said without hesitation. I've been waiting for this day for 5 years. If you're ready to tell the truth, then I'm ready to stand with you. The second call went to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had served as a medic during Nightingale operations and was now working as a trauma surgeon at a major hospital. Her response was more cautious but ultimately supportive. I've built a good life here, Jennifer said, and I'm concerned about how this revelation might affect my medical practice. But I also know that we can't keep living this lie forever. If you think it's time, then I trust your judgment. One by one, Sarah worked through her list of former teammates, explaining the situation and gauging their willingness to go public with their service records. The responses varied in their enthusiasm, but were unanimous in their support. These women had been living with the same burden Sarah had carried, the same frustration of watching debates about their capabilities while being unable to speak about their actual achievements. Colonel Richards, who had been listening to Sarah's side of the conversations, looked increasingly uncomfortable with each call. General, he said quietly, are we really prepared to deal with the media circus that's going to follow this revelation? The political implications alone. Colonel, Morrison interrupted, I've spent my entire career dealing with political implications. What I've learned is that the truth has a way of coming out eventually, regardless of how hard we try to suppress it. The question is whether we control that revelation or whether it controls us. Sergeant Williams, who had been remarkably composed throughout the entire ordeal, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What's the plan for actually going public? How do you reveal something like this without causing complete chaos? Morrison had clearly been thinking about this scenario for years. We start with a controlled disclosure to key members of Congress and the Pentagon leadership. We provide them with full documentation of the program and its success rate. Then we arrange for a joint press conference where Sarah and some of the other Nightingales can tell their stories in their own words. And what about the backlash? The Navy commander asked bluntly. Sarah finished her final call and looked up at the group. All 11 of them are on board. They're scared. They're concerned about their families and careers, but they're ready to stand together and tell the truth. Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the room. That's what I hope to hear. These women have shown the same courage in this decision that they showed in combat. But we still haven't addressed the elephant in the room, Richards insisted. There are going to be people who feel betrayed by this revelation. Members of Congress who were told one thing, while something completely different was happening. Military leaders who built policy based on incomplete information. The fallout could be devastating. You're right, Morrison acknowledged. There will be consequences for everyone involved in maintaining this secret. I expect to face court-martial proceedings, and my career is effectively over regardless of the outcome. But that's a price I'm willing to pay to finally give these women the recognition they've earned. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. Morrison was sacrificing everything to validate her service, and she wasn't sure she could live with that responsibility. General, there has to be another way. Some approach that doesn't destroy your career in the process. Sarah, he said gently, my career was always going to end eventually. The question is whether it ends with me hiding in the shadows, protecting a secret that should never have been kept, or whether it ends with me finally doing the right thing. Williams cleared his throat. Sir, what about the legal implications? Could Ms. Martinez and the others face charges for revealing classified information? That's a risk, Morrison admitted. But given the nature of the information and the public interest involved, I believe we can make a strong case that disclosure serves the greater good. Besides, the classification was always questionable from a legal standpoint. We were classifying successful operations to avoid political embarrassment, not to protect national security. The commander looked thoughtful. There's another consideration here. If we reveal Project Nightingale, it could actually strengthen the military's position on gender integration. Instead of arguing theoretically about women's capabilities, we'll have concrete proof of their success in the most demanding roles. Sarah nodded. That's exactly what I've been hoping for. Every time someone says women can't handle combat stress or physical demands, I want to be able to point to our record and say, actually, we already proved you wrong. But it will also raise questions about why the truth was hidden for so long, Richards pointed out. The military leadership will have to explain why they deceived Congress and the public about something this significant. Morrison shrugged. They'll have to take responsibility for decisions made above my pay grade. My job was to run the program and ensure its success. Their job was to decide how to handle the political implications. We all knew this day might come eventually. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see that it was from Maria Gonzalez. The others want to know about timeline, she reported. How quickly is this going to happen? Fast, Morrison replied. Once we make the decision to go public, we need to control the narrative from the beginning. I'm thinking we make the congressional briefings this week and hold the press conference next week. Williams looked stunned. That's incredibly fast for something this big. It has to be, Morrison explained. Word is already starting to leak from today's incident. Colonel Richards isn't the only person who heard Sarah's claims, and people are going to start asking questions. We either get ahead of the story or we lose control of it entirely. Sarah felt her heart rate increasing as the reality of what they were planning began to sink in. For years she had dreamed of this moment, but now that it was actually happening, she was terrified. What if we're wrong? What if the public isn't ready for this revelation? What if it hurts more than it helps? Sarah, Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority and warmth of a father figure. You and the other Nightingales proved beyond any doubt that women can serve with distinction in the most demanding military roles. That truth doesn't become less valid because some people aren't ready to hear it. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing a mixture of determination, fear, and anticipation. These men who had started the day as her accusers were now her allies in a mission that would change military history. All right, she said finally, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Let's do this. Let's tell the truth. Morrison smiled and pulled out his phone. Then let's make some calls. We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it. As the general began dialing numbers that would set the revelation in motion, Sarah realized that her quiet life as an anonymous veteran was about to end forever. In its place would come something she had never quite imagined, the chance to be part of changing history, not just through her service, but through her courage to finally speak about it. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood backstage at the Pentagon briefing room, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her dress uniform for the final time. The Navy had issued her a proper uniform reflecting her actual rank and service record, complete with ribbons and decorations that told the story of her classified career. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself as the woman who had been accused of stolen valor just a few weeks earlier. The media response to the initial revelation had been explosive. Within hours of General Morrison's congressional briefing, news outlets across the country were running stories about the secret female SEALs who had been operating in the shadows for years. The reaction had been everything they had anticipated and more: outrage from some quarters about the deception, amazement from others about the women's achievements, and intense curiosity from everyone about the details of their operations. "You ready for this?" asked Maria Gonzalez, who stood beside her in her own dress uniform. The 11 Nightingales had gathered at the Pentagon for what would be the most important press conference in military history. Each woman represented years of classified service, successful operations, and personal sacrifice that was finally going to be acknowledged. "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "I've been dreaming about this day for so long that I'm not sure I believe it's actually happening." Dr. Jennifer Walsh joined them, looking professional and composed despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. "I keep thinking about all the young women who are going to see this press conference. All the girls who will grow up knowing that these barriers have already been broken." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of interviews, briefings, and preparation. Congressional hearings had been intense, with some lawmakers expressing outrage about being kept in the dark, while others praised the program's success. The Pentagon had conducted its own internal review, ultimately concluding that Project Nightingale had been operationally successful, but politically problematic. General Morrison had indeed faced consequences for his role in maintaining the secret. He had been formally reprimanded and would be retiring earlier than planned, but he had avoided court-martial proceedings. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The revelation had fundamentally changed the conversation about women in combat roles. "Ladies," came a voice from behind them, and they turned to see Secretary of Defense Patricia Hamilton approaching. She had been one of the strongest advocates for revealing the truth about Nightingale, seeing it as an opportunity to accelerate gender integration across all military branches. "Madam Secretary," Sarah said, snapping to attention along with the others. "At ease," Hamilton replied with a smile. "I wanted to speak with you before we go out there. What you're about to do takes tremendous courage. You're not just telling your own stories. You're changing the future for every woman who wants to serve her country." Sarah felt a surge of emotion at the secretary's words. After years of feeling invisible and unrecognized, the validation meant more than she could express. "Thank you, ma'am. We've been waiting a long time for this moment. I know you have, and I want you to know that this administration is committed to ensuring that what happened to you never happens again. No service member should have to hide their achievements for political convenience." The stage manager appeared to signal that it was time. Sarah took a deep breath and followed her fellow Nightingales toward the briefing room, where dozens of reporters and cameras were waiting to hear their stories. As they walked onto the stage, Sarah was struck by the sight of the packed room. Reporters from major networks, military journalists, and political correspondents all leaned forward in anticipation. In the back of the room, she spotted Colonel Richards, who had become an unexpected ally in the aftermath of their confrontation. His career had survived the revelation, and he had publicly apologized for his initial skepticism. Secretary Hamilton took the podium first, providing context for the revelation and explaining the Pentagon's position on the events. Then it was Sarah's turn to step forward and tell her story to the world. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "For the past 5 years, I have been living with a secret that I was sworn never to reveal. Today, that changes." She spoke for 20 minutes, detailing her recruitment into Project Nightingale, her training, and her operational deployments. She described missions that had previously existed only in classified files, Operations that had saved lives and advanced national security interests in ways that the public had never known. I am not here today seeking sympathy or special recognition, she continued. I am here because the truth matters. For too long our society has debated whether women are capable of serving in combat roles while ignoring the fact that women have already proven their capabilities beyond any doubt. The questions from reporters were intense and wide-ranging. They wanted to know about the physical demands of the training, the psychological challenges of maintaining such a significant secret, and the impact on the families of the Nightingale operators. Each of the women took turns answering, providing insights into an experience that most people could never imagine. One reporter asked the question that Sarah had been expecting. Do you feel betrayed by the military leadership that forced you to keep your service secret for so long? Sarah considered her answer carefully. I feel disappointed that it took this long for the truth to come out. But I also understand the complex political environment that military leaders were navigating. What matters now is how we move forward and ensure that future generations of women have the opportunities that we were denied the chance to discuss openly. As the press conference wound down, Sarah felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced in years. The secret that had defined so much of her adult life was finally out in the open. There would be challenges ahead, continued scrutiny and debate, but there would also be recognition and validation. After the formal session ended, reporters continued to approach the Nightingales with follow-up questions. Sarah found herself surrounded by journalists who wanted to understand not just what she had done, but how it felt to finally be able to talk about it. The hardest part, she told one reporter, wasn't the physical demands of the missions or even the danger. It was coming home and having to pretend that none of it had happened. It was watching other veterans get recognition for their service, while knowing that mine would never be acknowledged. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room watching news coverage of the press conference. Every major network was leading with the story, and social media was exploding with reactions ranging from amazement to skepticism to outrage. But overwhelmingly, the response was positive, with many people expressing admiration for the Nightingale's service and frustration that their achievements had been hidden for so long. Her phone rang, and she saw that it was General Morrison calling. She answered immediately. I watched the press conference, he said. You did magnificently. All of you did. Thank you, sir. None of this would have been possible without your willingness to sacrifice your career for the truth. Morrison chuckled. My career was already winding down, Sarah, but yours is just beginning. The world knows about the Nightingales now, and that changes everything. As Sarah hung up the phone, she walked to the window of her hotel room and looked out at the lights of Washington, D.C. Somewhere out there were young women who had watched the press conference and were now dreaming of possibilities that hadn't existed just that morning. Somewhere were military leaders who were reconsidering their assumptions about gender and capability. And somewhere were other veterans, perhaps keeping their own secrets, who had been inspired by the courage to tell the truth. The journey that had begun with accusations of stolen valor in a security office had ended with a validation beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined. She was no longer a woman living in the shadows of her own service. She was finally, truly, a recognized veteran whose achievements would inspire future generations of women to break barriers that others insisted were unbreakable. For the first time in years, Sarah Martinez could tell anyone who asked exactly who she was and what she had done in service to her country, and that, she realized, was worth every difficult moment that had brought her to this point.